In a powerful moment on the House floor, Jasmine Crockett exposed what many are calling Tim Scott's most hidden political agenda, and the facts she revealed left everyone stunned. It was a regular day in Congress, until Jasmine Crockett dropped a bombshell that left the entire chamber in stunned silence. Known for her sharp tongue, unshakable confidence, and a reputation for cutting through political noise, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is no stranger to controversy. But on this day, she went beyond what anyone in the room, or watching at home, could have expected. She took direct aim at Senator Tim Scott, a figure often portrayed as a rising star within the Republican Party. What began as a standard policy hearing escalated into a dramatic moment of truth-telling that many are calling one of the boldest confrontations in recent congressional memory. From the moment she stood to speak, it was clear Crockett wasn't holding back. Her voice calm but firm, she addressed the chamber not just as a member of Congress, but as a representative of people whose struggles are too often ignored in political games. With cameras rolling and her colleagues watching intently, she launched into a takedown of Tim Scott's public image, one that's been carefully crafted over the years to appear moderate, bipartisan, and committed to unity. Crockett wasn't interested in surface-level slogans or rehearsed soundbites. She came armed with hard data, official documents, and a timeline of decisions that told a much different story. She began by exposing the contradictions in Scott's voting record, decisions that, according to her, consistently worked against the very communities he often claims to represent. While Scott has publicly advocated for economic opportunity and racial unity, Crockett pointed out how he repeatedly voted against legislation aimed at expanding voting rights, improving public education, and increasing access to affordable housing. With every example she gave, the room grew quieter. Lawmakers leaned in. Staffers stopped what they were doing. Something real was happening, and everyone could feel it. One of the most powerful moments came when Crockett held up a printed report detailing Scott's connections to major lobbying groups. She explained how these groups, many of them funded by corporate interests, have spent years pushing policies that cut taxes for the wealthy, weaken environmental protections, and roll back social safety nets. She linked these actions directly to Scott's campaign contributions and legislative priorities. It wasn't just opinion, it was a pattern. "This isn't about personality," she declared. "It's about policy. And these policies are hurting real people every single day." By this point, even those who had previously dismissed Crockett as overly combative couldn't deny the weight of her argument. Her delivery was passionate, but precise, grounded in facts, not emotion. She called out the hypocrisy of presenting oneself as a unifier while consistently siding with forces that divide. She referenced communities in her own district, working-class neighborhoods, single mothers, struggling students, and asked how much longer they'd have to wait for real representation. Her words echoed with urgency. "Don't talk about lifting people up while voting to keep them down." Her most searing line came when she looked directly into the camera and said, "It's time the American people knew the truth about Tim Scott." It was a mic drop moment, the kind that doesn't just shake a room, it shakes public perception. Social media exploded within minutes. Clips of her speech went viral, with hashtags like #TruthAboutScott and #CrockettExposes trending across platforms. Some viewers cheered her courage. Others were shocked by the information she presented, having never seen Scott's record laid out in such blunt terms. Even a few conservative commentators admitted the confrontation was impossible to ignore. But beyond the headlines and the online buzz, Crockett's speech touched on something deeper, a growing demand for accountability in American politics. People are tired of polished speeches and carefully curated images. They want leaders who are willing to challenge the status quo and expose what's happening behind closed doors. In that moment, Crockett wasn't just confronting Tim Scott. She was challenging a political culture that often rewards silence over truth. What makes her action even more significant is that she did it knowing full well the backlash that could follow. Taking on a prominent senator isn't easy, especially one with national visibility and powerful allies. But Crockett showed that courage and leadership doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It means stepping into it when justice demands it. And that's exactly what she did. As the hearing ended and the camera shut off, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another day in Congress. It was a turning point, a moment where a rising voice called out a carefully protected narrative and demanded better for the people watching at home. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak. She sparked a conversation that's still unfolding. And whether you agree with her or not, there's no denying she left the country with one question that refuses to be ignored. What is Tim Scott really standing for? So what exactly did Jasmine Crockett expose? What seemed like just another political disagreement turned into a moment of raw truth when Crockett began laying out her case against Senator Tim Scott. Her tone was measured, but her message was explosive. Tim Scott, a man who has built his brand on moderation and unity, has been quietly backing policies and partnerships that do more harm than good, especially to the communities he claims to uplift. Jasmine Crockett began her takedown not with emotion, but with evidence. She brought forward a stack of official documents, voting records, public funding reports, and campaign contribution data. These weren't rumors or assumptions. They were hard facts. And as she laid them out one by one, the image of Tim Scott as a reasonable conservative began to crumble right before everyone's eyes. She pointed out how Scott, despite his repeated claims to support equality and fairness, had voted against key voting rights legislation, including bills meant to protect access to the ballot for minority and low-income voters. These were laws that civil rights leaders had championed, but Scott stood in opposition. Crockett didn't just say it. She showed it, citing the bill names, dates, and outcomes. For millions of Americans who rely on those protections, Scott's votes weren't just disappointing. They were dangerous. Then she moved on to the money. Crockett revealed how Tim Scott had supported a series of tax breaks and economic policies that sound helpful on the surface, but have deep consequences. These loopholes, she explained, allow massive corporations and wealthy donors to avoid paying their fair share of taxes, draining billions from programs meant to support working-class neighborhoods, schools, public transportation, and affordable housing. Meanwhile, the communities most in need, many of them Black, Latino, and under-resourced, continue to suffer. And she didn't stop there. Crockett exposed what she called a troubling web of connections between Scott's office and high-powered lobbying groups. She presented evidence showing how many of these organizations have consistently opposed progressive policies like affordable housing initiatives, increased education funding, and meaningful police reform. These groups aren't neutral players. They have specific agendas. And, according to Crockett, they've helped shape Scott's political decisions from behind the scenes. What really hit home was how clearly Crockett connected the dots. She showed how these lobbyists funneled money into Scott's campaign, then later saw him vote in favor of policies that benefited their interests. These were not isolated events, they were patterns. And in a voice that was both calm and cutting, she asked the question that left the room in silence. How can you say you stand for progress when your actions consistently hold it back? That question, simple as it was, cut through all the political noise. It wasn't just aimed at Scott. It was aimed at every politician who says the right things while doing the opposite behind closed doors. Crockett's argument wasn't that Scott made a few bad calls. Her point was that his entire agenda may be built on a contradiction. What especially shocked the public was how she tied all of this back to Scott's frequent messaging about opportunity and race. Tim Scott often talks about being a black man in America, rising through struggle, and promoting conservative values that emphasize personal responsibility and economic independence. But Crockett countered that with a brutal truth. If you're voting against the systems that support equality, if you're aligning with groups that actively fight against justice, then you're not uplifting your community. You're abandoning it. She cited his opposition to police reform bills that aim to reduce brutality and increase accountability. She highlighted his resistance to expanding federal support for public schools in underserved neighborhoods. These aren't small policy differences. They are life-changing issues for millions of Americans. Her message resonated with people across the political spectrum because it wasn't just about left versus right. It was about truth versus image. Crockett challenged the carefully constructed persona of Tim Scott and replaced it with facts that couldn't be ignored. And in doing so, she forced a national conversation about what kind of leadership this country truly needs. As the dust settled, one thing became crystal clear. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed Tim Scott's hidden agenda. She had exposed a broader failure in American politics, where branding too often outweighs action, and where saying the right thing is treated as more important than doing it. By the time she finished, it was no longer a question of whether Scott's record had contradictions. The only question left was how long those contradictions would be allowed to continue before the voters demanded better. The most powerful moment of Jasmine Crockett's takedown came when she reached into a folder, calmly pulled out a printed copy of Tim Scott's voting record, held it up, and declared for the entire room to hear. This isn't personal. This is about policy. And these policies, they're hurting our people. With that single line, the room shifted. What had started as a heated exchange became something deeper, something undeniable. You could see the tension rise as lawmakers leaned forward, unsure of what was coming next, but knowing, instinctively, that this wasn't going to be just another political back and forth. Crockett didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her power came from the weight of the truth she carried. Holding that voting record in one hand, she began flipping through it, page by page, bill by bill. Each time she stopped, she pointed out legislation that Senator Tim Scott had either blocked or opposed, all while publicly claiming to stand for progress, equity, and opportunity. One page showed his vote against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, a bill designed to restore and strengthen parts of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court had weakened. Crockett read it aloud, then asked, "How can a man who talks about the importance of democracy vote against protecting it?" Next, she pointed to his opposition to police reform legislation, proposals that aim to increase transparency, limit the use of deadly force, and hold law enforcement accountable. Crockett didn't just quote the bill. She reminded the room of real names, black men and women who had died unjustly, whose families still fight for justice. She asked, "How can someone talk about healing the nation, yet stand in the way of accountability?" Then came the money trail. Crockett shifted her focus to campaign contributions, something most voters rarely think about, but which often drives decisions behind closed doors. With precision, she laid out the names of major donors and corporate PACs that had contributed to Tim Scott's campaigns, many of which were tied to lobbying efforts against affordable housing, climate justice, labor rights, and education funding. These weren't vague accusations. She had receipts. She showed how Scott had received significant financial support from real estate interest groups that had opposed legislation to make housing more accessible to low-income families. Not long after those contributions were made, he voted against federal housing relief efforts. Another example pointed to donations from powerful corporations known for opposing student loan forgiveness. Then, as Crockett noted, Scott voted against relief bills during the pandemic that would have helped struggling borrowers. Her voice remained steady, but the message landed like thunder. And the reaction? Immediate. Clips of her speech, especially the part where she said, "Policy isn't neutral when it's used as a weapon against the vulnerable," spread like wildfire across social media. TikTok creators began breaking down each vote she mentioned. Twitter, now called X, lit up with hashtags like hashtag Crockett exposes Scott, hashtag receipts don't lie, and hashtag hidden agenda revealed. On Instagram, reels of the speech were reshared by activists, educators, and even celebrities. What shocked many wasn't just what Crockett revealed, it was how clear she made it. She didn't bury the facts in jargon or complex explanations. She laid them out like puzzle pieces, showing exactly how Tim Scott's record didn't match the image he presented to the world. Even some of his longtime supporters were caught off guard. A few well-known conservative commentators admitted on air that they had never scrutinized Scott's record so closely. Callers on political radio shows expressed a mix of confusion and betrayal. "I thought he was different," one caller said, "but if what she said is true, I need to rethink who I'm supporting." Other voters, especially independents and moderate Democrats, began demanding more transparency. Why hadn't these connections been discussed before? Why had so much of this flown under the radar? And that, perhaps, was Jasmine Crockett's greatest achievement in that moment. Not just exposing one senator, but exposing a system of silence. A system where politicians rely on the public staying uninformed, where words are used as distractions from votes, and where donors often have more influence than citizens. By the end of her speech, Crockett didn't just leave her mark. She changed the entire narrative. She reminded the country that political power should come with accountability, and that no amount of polished speeches or staged unity could erase the truth. The hearing may have ended, but the impact is still unfolding. Conversations are continuing online, in communities, and in newsrooms. More voters are digging into records, asking questions, and refusing to accept empty rhetoric. And it all started with one congresswoman holding up a voting record and saying, "This isn't personal. This is about policy. And these policies are hurting our people." Sometimes, that's all it takes to wake up a nation. What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just political theater. It was accountability in action. In an age where politics is often reduced to sound bites and carefully curated social media posts, Crockett did something rare. She demanded truth. Real, tangible, uncomfortable truth. She didn't show up to put on a performance. She showed up to hold someone accountable. And not just someone, but a sitting U.S. senator whose record had long escaped public scrutiny. When Crockett stood in that chamber and exposed Tim Scott's voting history, campaign contributions, and contradictions, she wasn't doing it for applause. She was doing it because she believes voters deserve better. She believes people deserve leaders who act on their promises, not just talk about them. And in that moment, she reminded everyone watching, whether in Congress or at home, that the true measure of a politician is not what they say, but what they do. Too often, elected officials hide behind vague language, phrases like economic opportunity, American values, or working across the aisle. They deliver polished speeches, smile at town halls, and tweet about unity. But when it's time to vote, those same politicians often back policies that harm the people they claim to represent. Jasmine Crockett pulled back the curtain on that hypocrisy. And she didn't just expose it, she named it, confronted it, and challenged it head-on. She made it clear, words are not enough. Not when communities are struggling. Not when people can't afford housing, health care, or education. Not when injustice goes unchecked. Crockett stood in that room with the courage to say what many Americans have been feeling for years, that the system isn't broken because of silence. It's broken because too many have pretended everything is fine. In calling out Tim Scott, Crockett wasn't just confronting one politician. She was challenging a much deeper issue in American politics, the disconnect between representation and reality. Scott, a black Republican, often speaks about his upbringing and the challenges he's overcome. He uses his personal story as a bridge to connect with voters and speak on issues of race and opportunity. But as Crockett laid out his voting record, she forced a difficult question into the spotlight. Can you claim to represent a community while voting against its needs? That's where Crockett's strength truly shined. As a black woman from Texas, a state that's seen its share of political battles, Crockett's presence in Congress is powerful on its own. But it's what she chooses to do with that platform that sets her apart. She doesn't just represent her district. She speaks for every person who feels invisible in a political system that too often overlooks them. When she said, "Don't let someone stand on a stage and talk about your pain if they're not willing to vote for your healing," she wasn't just delivering a clever line. She was telling the truth. And that line hit hard. Social media lit up with people repeating it, quoting it, and discussing it. Activists reposted it. Commentators called it one of the most honest things said in Congress in years. For many, it felt like a wake-up call, a reminder that true representation isn't about identity alone. It's about action. It's about voting for policies that bring real change, not just political points. Crockett's moment also reignited a larger conversation around who gets to speak for whom in politics. Far too often, people from marginalized backgrounds are expected to accept symbolic gestures as substitutes for real progress. A speech here, a visit there. But Crockett's confrontation flipped the script. She said, in essence, if you're not fighting for us in policy, then don't pretend you're with us in principle. And perhaps that's why her words landed so powerfully, because they weren't just about Tim Scott. They were about a political culture that prioritizes image over integrity, optics over outcomes. She reminded voters that it's not enough to elect someone who looks like change. You have to elect someone who votes like change. In a time when it's easy to feel cynical about government, when many believe their voices don't matter, Jasmine Crockett showed that one voice can matter, that one person with courage and clarity can break through the noise. And most importantly, that accountability is not optional, it's essential. Her message was clear. Pay attention to the votes, not just the speeches. Follow the money, not just the media. And demand more, not just from your opponents, but from everyone who claims to serve you. Because democracy isn't just about electing leaders. It's about making sure they earn the trust they've been given. And on that day, Jasmine Crockett reminded the nation of exactly what that looks like. As of now, Senator Tim Scott hasn't offered a direct response to the claims made by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. In the face of mounting scrutiny and national attention, his office released only a short, carefully worded statement. The senator remains focused on solutions for all Americans. It was the kind of political response we've come to expect, vague, non-committal, and deliberately steering clear of specifics. But this time, that type of response may not be enough. Because Crockett's takedown wasn't just another viral moment. It wasn't an outburst or a political stunt. It was a meticulously constructed argument backed by facts, records, and receipts. And it resonated far beyond the walls of Congress. Since that moment, political analysts and journalists have taken a closer look at Scott's voting history, campaign donors, and legislative partnerships. What they're uncovering only adds fuel to the fire. More inconsistencies, more connections to powerful lobbying groups, and more instances where Scott's votes don't seem to align with the values he claims to champion. Multiple watchdog groups are now publicly calling for a formal investigation into Senator Scott's financial ties, especially those linked to firms that have lobbied against policies benefiting underserved communities. These calls aren't coming from one side of the aisle either. In a rare display of bipartisan concern, even some moderate conservatives are questioning whether the image Scott presents to the public truly reflects his record. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's political stock is rising fast. What began as a fiery confrontation has become a defining moment for her career. Across progressive circles, she's being celebrated not only for her courage, but for her clarity. She didn't just accuse, she informed. She didn't just criticize, she educated. And in doing so, she connected with a wide audience that's hungry for real leadership. Progressive activists, grassroots organizers, and independent voters are rallying around her message. Many say Crockett is a breath of fresh air in a political environment that often feels stale and disingenuous. She's become a new symbol of unapologetic truth-telling, a voice that refuses to water down the facts or sugarcoat injustice. And for younger voters especially, who are disillusioned with the performative side of politics, her authenticity is resonating. This moment also comes at a critical time. The 2024 election cycle is heating up, and voters are watching more closely than ever. Gone are the days when politicians could hide behind photo ops and rehearse talking points. Today, one clip can go viral, one speech can spark national debate, and one act of bold honesty can redefine a career. That's exactly what's happening here. Jasmine Crockett's confrontation has done more than shine a light on Tim Scott. It's awakened a new level of civic awareness. Voters are no longer just listening to what politicians say. They're digging into what they've actually done. They're reading the fine print. They're following the money. And they're holding public servants accountable in ways that go far beyond party lines. For Senator Scott, the pressure is growing. While he has enjoyed a relatively safe political image up to this point, often praised as a thoughtful conservative voice, he now finds himself under a microscope. The narrative has shifted. No longer is the conversation about his background or his speeches. Now it's about his votes, his alliances, and the tangible impact of his decisions on real people. And that shift is powerful. It signals a deeper change in the political landscape, one where action outweighs image, and where politicians are judged not by the stories they tell, but by the results they deliver. Crockett's stand has reminded us that accountability doesn't always come from a formal hearing or a court case. Sometimes, it comes from a courageous voice refusing to let the truth be buried. This isn't just about one senator. It's about what we expect from all our leaders moving forward. The takeaway: this wasn't just a viral moment. It was a wake-up call. It was a call for transparency, for integrity, and for the kind of leadership that refuses to bend to powerful donors or political convenience. It was a reminder that democracy only works when people, elected or not, have the courage to demand better. And now, thanks to Jasmine Crockett, the spotlight is firmly on Tim Scott. His record is being re-examined, his alliances are being questioned, and the easy political cover he once enjoyed is fading fast. Whether he chooses to respond in full or continue to deflect, one thing is certain. He can't hide in the shadows any longer. The people are watching. The pressure is rising. And the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is finally out in the open. If you've ever felt like politicians say one thing and do another, this story proves you're not imagining it. Jasmine Crockett reminded us all that leadership, without accountability, is just empty speech. And if more leaders follow her example, the game might finally change. If you found this story important, like, share, and subscribe, because the truth deserves to be heard. And we'll be here to break it down for you, every step of the way.